A dying man needs to die, as a sleepy man needs to sleep. And there comes a time when it is wrong as well as useless to resist. My grandfather used to quote C.C. Lewis to me when I was young, sitting on his deathbed in our little house in Detroit, teaching me about dignity in the face of death. I carried those words with me for 73 years, thinking I understood what they meant. But sometimes, fellas, sometimes you discover that the people you love most are counting down the minutes until you're gone, not because they'll miss you, but because they can't wait to divide up what you've left behind. I was supposed to be unconscious. That's what the doctors told my family. That's what the machines and monitors suggested. That's what everyone believed as I lay there in the ICU after my massive heart attack. But I could hear everything, every whispered conversation, every hushed phone call, every word they thought I'd never know they said. And that's how I learned that my 3 children, the kids I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for my entire adult life, couldn't wait for me to die. When do you think it'll happen? My daughter Jessica asked my son Michael as they stood at the foot of my hospital bed, thinking I was too far gone to understand what they were saying. Dr. Patterson said maybe a week, maybe 2 if he's stubborn, Michael replied, checking his phone like he was waiting for a stock price to update. Good. That gives us time to get the house appraised and figure out how to divide everything up, said my youngest, Brandon. I already called a realtor. She says the market's hot right now. We could probably get $400,000 for the house, maybe more. $400,000. They were talking about selling the house I'd built with my own hands, the home where I'd raised them, where their mother had died, where every room held memories of our family, and they were discussing it like it was just another piece of inventory to liquidate. What about Dad's tools and equipment? Jessica asked. Some of that stuff might be worth something. I'll handle that, Michael said. I know a guy who buys construction equipment. We can probably get a decent price for the truck, too. The truck, my 1987 Ford F-150 that I'd bought new, that had carried me to every job site for 36 years, that had never let me down when my family needed me to provide for them. They were already planning to sell it before my body was even cold. That's when I realized the truth that would change everything. My children weren't grieving my impending death. They were celebrating it. They were treating my ICU room like a real estate office, my life like a business transaction, my love like something that had a cash value attached to it. If you've ever been reduced to dollar signs by the people you die for, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. Where you watching from? Let's see where our brotherhood stretches, because I got a feeling this story is going to hit every father who's ever wondered if his sacrifices meant anything to his children. My name is Rob Briggs, and 73 years old now, born in 1951 in Detroit, Michigan, to parents who believed that a man's worth was measured by how hard he worked and how well he provided for his family. My daddy was a line worker at Ford. My mama cleaned houses for white folks on the good side of town, and they raised me to believe that love was something you showed through your actions, not just your words. Rob, my daddy used to tell me as we worked on cars in our garage on Saturday afternoons, talking don't feed your family, working does. Remember that when you grow up and have children of your own. I took those words to heart, made it through high school, learned the construction trade from my Uncle Willie, and by the time I was 25, I was running my own crew, building houses and commercial buildings all over the Detroit metro area. Nothing fancy, but honest work that paid honest money and gave me the skills to provide for a family. The thing about growing up the way I did is that you learn the value of everything. Every dollar earned, every tool bought, every improvement made to your home. You don't waste anything. You don't take anything for granted. And you sure don't expect anybody to hand you something you haven't worked for. That's why when I met Patricia Coleman at a church function in 1975, I was ready to be somebody's husband and somebody's daddy. She was 23, working as a secretary at a law firm with brown hair and green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she laughed. She came from a working class white family in Warren, folks who understood the value of hard work and honest living. "You different from other men I've met," she told me that first night as we sat in my car outside her apartment, talking until the sun came up. Different how? You'll look at me like you're planning a future, not just trying to figure out how to get me into bed. I like that about her, how she valued commitment and stability over flashy romance. We courted for 10 months before I proposed, and she said yes without hesitation. "Rob Briggs," she said, tears streaming down her face, "you're going to make me the happiest woman in Michigan." We married in the spring of 1976, a beautiful ceremony at her family's church with about 80 people. Her parents seemed genuinely happy about our union, and I felt like I was starting the life I'd always dreamed of. Good woman, steady work, plans for children, and a future built on love and hard work. Patricia got pregnant right away, and Jessica was born in early 1977. Michael came along in 1979, and Brandon followed in 1982, 3 healthy, beautiful children who became the center of my universe. From the day each of them was born, I made a promise to myself and to Patricia. These children would never want for anything I could provide. They would have better clothes than I'd had, better education, better opportunities. They would know they were loved not just through words, but through the sacrifices I was willing to make for their futures. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, building other people's homes during the day and working on our own house at night and on weekends. I added rooms as the kids got older, finished the basement so they'd have a place to play, built a deck where we could have family barbecues. "Daddy, you work too much," Jessica used to tell me when she was little, climbing onto my lap when I'd come home exhausted from a job site. "I work this much because I love you," I'd tell her. "Everything Daddy does is for you and Michael and Brandon." And I meant it. Every blister on my hands, every ache in my back, every long day in the heat or cold was an investment in their futures. I wasn't just building houses for other people. I was building a legacy for my children. Patricia was a wonderful mother and wife. She kept the house running smoothly, made sure the kids did their homework, attended every school play and sporting event. We were a team, working together to give our children the best life we could provide. But even in those early years, I noticed that the kids seemed to take our sacrifices for granted. When other families couldn't afford new clothes or family vacations, our children just expected those things. When their friends' parents said no to expensive requests, our kids couldn't understand why anyone would say no to their children. They're just used to being provided for, Patricia would say when I worried that we might be spoiling them. That's what good parents do. We make sure our children don't have to worry about money. Maybe that was our first mistake. We wanted to give them security, but we ended up giving them entitlement. We wanted them to feel love, but we ended up teaching them that love came in the form of material things. Despite my concerns about spoiling them, I loved those kids with everything I had. Jessica was my little princess, always wanting to help me with projects around the house, asking a million questions about how things worked. Michael was my sports buddy, playing catch in the backyard, going to Tigers games when I could afford tickets. Brandon was my little comedian, always making us laugh with his impressions and jokes. Every evening after work, no matter how tired I was, I'd spend time with each of them individually, help Jessica with her homework, throw the ball with Michael, read stories to Brandon. Weekends were for family time, building things together, teaching them how to use tools, taking them fishing at the lake. "You're such a good daddy," Patricia would tell me as she watched me help the kids with their school projects or fix their broken toys. "I just want them to know they're loved," I'd say. "I want them to have memories of their father being present." And I was present. Every school play, every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference. When Jessica broke her arm falling off her bike, I was the one who carried her to the emergency room. When Michael was getting bullied at school, I was the one who taught him how to stand up for himself. When Brandon was afraid of the dark, I was the one who sat by his bed until he fell asleep. But as they got older, the kids seemed to appreciate my presence less and my providing more. Instead of wanting to spend time with me, they wanted me to buy them things. Instead of asking for help with projects, they asked for money, for clothes and gadgets and activities. Dad, can I have $50 to go to the mall with my friends? Became Jessica's favorite question when she was in high school. Dad, I need new cleats for baseball, Michael would say, even when his current cleats were barely a year old. Dad, everyone else has a Nintendo. When can we get one? Brandon would ask, making me feel guilty for not already buying something I couldn't really afford. I said yes, more often than I should have. When they asked for money, I gave it. When they wanted new clothes, I bought them. When they needed cars in high school, I found a way to make it happen. I took on extra jobs, worked longer hours, delayed my own retirement plans, all to make sure my children had everything they wanted. You're gonna work yourself to death, Patricia warned me when I started taking on weekend jobs to pay for Michael's college tuition. It's worth it if it means my kids get a good education, I said. I didn't go to college. I want them to have opportunities I never had. All 3 kids went to college, and I paid for every penny of it. Jessica studied business at Michigan State. Michael got a degree in marketing from Wayne State, and Brandon went to community college for graphic design. I was proud of their achievements, proud that I'd been able to give them the education they needed to build good lives. But somewhere along the way, I realized that my children saw me differently than I saw myself. To me, I was a loving father who worked hard to provide for his family. To them, I was a source of funding for their goals and desires. When they needed something, they called. When they didn't need anything, I barely heard from them. The kids are busy with their own lives, Patricia would say when I complained about how rarely they visited or called. That's normal. It means we raised them to be independent. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was natural for adult children to focus on their own families and careers. But it hurt that the kids I'd sacrificed so much for seemed to see me primarily as a resource rather than a person they enjoyed spending time with. Patricia got sick when she was only 58, ovarian cancer that the doctor said had probably been growing for years before anyone noticed. The last 2 years of her life were brutal, filled with chemotherapy and radiation and surgeries that gave us hope before crushing it again. I took care of her every day, driving her to treatments, helping her with basic tasks when she became too weak to manage alone, holding her hand through the worst of it. The kids visited sometimes, but they always seemed uncomfortable with the reality of their mother's illness. It's hard for them to see her like this, I told myself. They don't know how to handle watching their mother die. But even after Patricia passed in 2016, the kids' visits remained infrequent. They came for the funeral, helped clean out her clothes and personal items, then went back to their own lives. I was left alone in the house we built together, surrounded by memories and wondering if my children would ever see me as more than an obligation to check in on occasionally. The first sign that my children might not have the deep love for me that I had for them came about 6 months after Patricia's funeral. I was struggling with loneliness and depression, and I asked Jessica if she might want to have dinner together once a week, just to stay connected. Dad, I'd love to, but I'm so busy with work and the kids, she said. Maybe we could talk on the phone instead. But those phone calls never materialized. When I called her, she always seemed distracted or in a hurry to get off the phone. When I suggested visiting her family, she always had reasons why it wasn't a good time. Michael was even more distant. He lived less than an hour away, but I saw him maybe 3 times a year, usually only on holidays or when he needed something. How's work going, son? I'd ask when I managed to get him on the phone. Fine, Dad. Look, I can't talk long. I'm in the middle of something. Brandon was the most communicative of the 3, but even his conversations seemed forced, like he was checking an item off a to-do list rather than actually wanting to talk to his father. The second sign came when I needed minor surgery to repair a hernia in 2018. I asked if one of the kids could drive me to the hospital and pick me up afterward since I wouldn't be able to drive myself. I wish I could, Dad, but I have a presentation at work that day, Jessica said. I've got a client meeting I can't reschedule, Michael said. I'm supposed to work that day and I can't really afford to take time off, Brandon said. I ended up taking an Uber to the hospital and having a neighbor pick me up. It was a small thing, but it made me realize that I wasn't a priority in my children's lives, even when I genuinely needed their help. The third sign was how they talked to me about money. Whenever one of them called, it seemed like the conversation eventually turned to my finances, my house, my plans for the future. Dad, you should really think about selling the house and moving into something smaller, Jessica would say. It's too much work for you to maintain, and think of all the equity you could access. Have you updated your will lately? Michael would ask. You want to make sure everything is in order, legally speaking. Dad, you're sitting on a gold mine with that house, Brandon would say. You could sell it and live comfortably for the rest of your life. At first, I thought they were genuinely concerned about my welfare. The house was big for one person, and maintaining it was becoming more difficult as I got older. But something about the way they discussed it made me uncomfortable, like they were more interested in the financial aspects than in my actual well-being. The fourth sign was how they reacted when I started dating someone. About 2 years after Patricia died, I met Linda Morrison at a senior center activity. She was a 68-year-old widow who had lost her husband to a heart attack, and we found comfort in each other's company. Dad, don't you think you're moving a little fast? Jessica asked when I told her about Linda. Mom's only been gone 2 years. Are you sure this woman isn't just interested in your money? Michael asked. You need to be careful about people who might take advantage of you. Dad, I hope you're not thinking about getting married again, Brandon said. That could really complicate things with inheritance and stuff. Like they were already planning what would happen to my money when I died. Linda and I dated for about a year, and she was a wonderful companion. We'd go to dinner, watch movies, take walks around the neighborhood. She was kind, intelligent, and genuinely seemed to enjoy my company. But the kids never warmed up to her, and their constant warnings about her motives eventually made me doubt the relationship. Maybe they're right, I told Linda one evening when she asked why I seemed distant. Maybe we're both just lonely and this isn't real. Rob, she said, your children don't want you to be happy. They want you to stay lonely and isolated so they can be the only important people in your life. But more than that, I think they're worried that if you remarry, there'll be less money for them when you're gone. I didn't want to believe that Linda was right, but her words planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following months. Were my children really concerned about my welfare, or were they protecting their inheritance? The fifth sign was how they handled holidays and special occasions. My birthday became a phone call and maybe a card. Father's Day was acknowledged with a text message. Christmas was a brief visit where they seemed more interested in getting through the obligation than actually celebrating with me. We can't stay long, Dad, became the standard opening line for any family gathering. We've got other commitments that were apparently more important than spending time with their father. The final warning sign came in early 2024 when I had a minor heart episode that required a trip to the emergency room. It turned out to be nothing serious, just a scare that reminded me I was getting older and my health wasn't guaranteed. But when I called to tell the kids about the incident, their reactions were strange. How serious was it? Jessica asked, and something in her tone made me think she was hoping for a specific answer. Did the doctor say anything about your long-term prognosis? Michael asked, like he was gathering information for a report. Are you okay financially if you need more medical care? Brandon asked, which seemed like an odd first concern. None of them asked if I was scared, if I needed anything, if they could come visit to make sure I was all right. They asked about the medical details and the financial implications, like they were assessing a situation that might affect them rather than expressing concern for their father's well-being. But I still didn't want to believe what all these signs were telling me. These were my children, the kids I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. Surely they loved me back, even if they had a strange way of showing it. Surely they weren't just waiting for me to die so they could inherit my money and property. It took nearly dying for me to learn the truth about what I really meant to the people I'd spent my life loving. The massive heart attack hit me at home on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. I was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper when suddenly it felt like someone had wrapped a steel band around my chest and was tightening it until I couldn't breathe. I managed to call 911 before I collapsed, and the paramedics found me unconscious on my kitchen floor. By the time I got to the hospital, the doctor said I'd been without oxygen for several minutes and had suffered significant damage to my heart muscle. It's going to be touch and go. I heard Dr. Patterson tell someone, though at the time I didn't know who he was talking to. The next few days will tell us a lot about his chances for recovery. For the first day, I was completely out. The medications and the trauma had knocked me unconscious, and I wasn't aware of anything happening around me. But by the second day, something strange started happening. I could hear conversations, understand what people were saying, but I couldn't respond. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move, couldn't speak. The doctors called it a coma, but it wasn't like the complete unconsciousness you see in movies. It was more like being trapped inside my own body, aware but unable to communicate. The kids must have arrived sometime during that first day, because when I started becoming aware of my surroundings, I could hear their voices in my room. At first, I was so relieved to know they were there. My children had come to be with me during the worst crisis of my life. They were going to support me through this recovery, just like I'd supported them through every crisis they'd ever faced. But as the hours passed and I listened to their conversations, I realized that they weren't there to support my recovery. They were there to plan my funeral. The doctor said it could happen anytime. Jessica was saying to someone on her phone, his heart is barely functioning, and even if he survives, he'll probably have brain damage from the lack of oxygen. Brain damage. She was talking about me like I was already gone, like the person lying in the bed wasn't her father, but just a shell that used to contain him. We need to start making arrangements, I heard Michael tell someone, probably his wife. I'll call the funeral home tomorrow and get some prices. We should do something nice, but not too expensive. Not too expensive. They were planning my funeral and already thinking about how to save money on it. That's when I heard the conversation that broke my heart into pieces so small I wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. When do you think it'll happen? Jessica asked Michael as they stood at the foot of my hospital bed. Dr. Patterson said maybe a week, maybe two, if he's stubborn, Michael replied. Good. That gives us time to get the house appraised and figure out how to divide everything up, Brandon said. I already called a realtor. She says the market's hot right now. We could probably get $400,000 for the house, maybe more. They were planning to sell my house. The house I'd built with my own hands, where I'd raised them, where their mother had died, where every room held memories of our family. And they were talking about it like it was just another piece of property to liquidate. What about Dad's tools and equipment? Jessica asked. Some of that stuff might be worth something. I'll handle that, Michael said. I know a guy who buys construction equipment. We can probably get a decent price for the truck too. My tools, the instruments of my trade that had fed and clothed them for their entire childhoods. The truck that had carried me to every job that paid for their college educations. They were already planning to sell it all. We should probably go through his papers too, Brennan said. Make sure we understand what accounts he has, what investments, all that stuff. I think he's got a safe in the bedroom, Jessica said. We'll need to figure out the combination. Mom probably left some records somewhere, Michael said. We'll find everything. They were talking about going through my personal belongings, accessing my private financial information, dividing up my life's work like it was just a business transaction, and they were doing it while standing 3 feet away from my hospital bed. Thinking I couldn't hear them, but the worst part was yet to come. You know what I keep thinking about? Jessica said. How much easier this is going to make everything. No more worrying about Dad living alone. No more guilt trips about not visiting enough. No more having to pretend we enjoy spending time with him. Pretend. She'd been pretending to enjoy spending time with me. I know what you mean, Michael said. I love Dad, but honestly, he's been kind of a burden for the last few years, always wanting us to visit, always making us feel guilty for having our own lives. A burden. The man who'd worked 6 days a week for 20 years to provide for them was a burden. At least we won't have to worry about him remarrying some gold digger who'd take half our inheritance, Brandon said. Remember how paranoid we had to be about that Linda woman? So that's why they had been so opposed to Linda. Not because they were concerned about me being taken advantage of, but because they were worried about their inheritance being reduced. Speaking of inheritance, Jessica said, do you think he's got a will? He better, Michael said. If he dies without a will, this could get complicated legally. I think Mom made him write one years ago, Brandon said. It's probably in that safe with all his other papers. They were discussing my death like it was a foregone conclusion, planning how to divide up my assets like I was already dead. But even worse than that, they were revealing that their entire relationship with me in recent years had been based on obligation and greed rather than love. Every phone call I'd treasured, thinking it meant they cared about me, had actually been them checking in on their investment. Every visit I'd looked forward to had been them fulfilling an obligation they resented. Every expression of concern about my health had been them protecting their financial future. I wanted to scream, wanted to sit up in that bed and confront them with what I'd heard, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but lie there and listen to my children celebrate my impending death. I feel terrible saying this, Jessica said, but I'm actually kind of relieved. Is that awful? No, Michael said. I feel the same way. It's been hard watching him get old and needy. At least this way, he won't suffer through years of decline. And we won't have to take care of him, Brandon added. I was dreading the day when he couldn't live independently anymore. They weren't just waiting for me to die so they could inherit my money. They were relieved that they wouldn't have to take care of me as I aged. The man who'd taken care of them their entire lives was seen as a burden they were grateful to avoid. That night, after the kids had gone home to plan my funeral and divide up my assets, I lay in that ICU bed and realized that everything I believed about my family was a lie. My children didn't love me. They tolerated me because they had to, and they were counting down the days until they wouldn't have to anymore. I'd spent my entire adult life sacrificing for people who saw me as nothing more than a source of funding and an eventual inheritance. I'd worked myself nearly to death to provide for children who couldn't wait for me to actually do. Something changed in me that night as I lay there processing what I'd heard. Maybe it was the shock of the truth, maybe it was the medications, or maybe it was just my body's way of protecting itself from more emotional trauma. But over the next few days, I started to improve physically, even as I grappled with the devastating knowledge of my children's true feelings. My heart function stabilized, my blood pressure normalized. The doctor started talking about recovery instead of death, much to their surprise, and I would soon learn, much to my children's disappointment. It's remarkable, Dr. Patterson told the kids during one of his updates. His vital signs are improving dramatically. We're cautiously optimistic that he'll make a full recovery. I could sense the change in the room's energy when he said that. The kids weren't celebrating this good news. They were adjusting to it, recalculating their plans, figuring out what this meant for the timeline they'd been working on. That's wonderful, Jessica said, but her voice sounded flat, mechanical. How long do you think he'll need to stay in the hospital? Michael asked, and I could hear the impatience in his question. Probably another week, then maybe a rehabilitation facility for a few weeks after that, Dr. Patterson said. But given his progress, I expect him to eventually return to independent living. Independent living, the thing they'd been hoping to avoid having to deal with. By the end of that week, I was able to open my eyes and speak, though I was still very weak. The first thing I saw was Jessica sitting beside my bed, scrolling through her phone. Dad, she said when she noticed I was awake, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, I managed to say, my voice barely working. The doctors say you're going to be okay, she said, and I searched her face for signs of relief or happiness. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like disappointment. Over the next few days, as I continued to improve, the kids visited regularly, but always seemed distracted, like they were going through the motions of being concerned children rather than actually feeling concerned. We're so glad you're recovering, Dad, Michael said during one visit. We were really worried, but I'd heard him talking. I knew they hadn't been worried about my health. They'd been worried about how long the dying process would take and whether it would interfere with their other plan. Is there anything you need? Brandon asked, but something about the way he said it made me think he was hoping the answer would be no. Just having you kids here is enough, I said, testing them to see how they'd respond. Well, we can't stay too long today, Jessica said quickly. We all have things we need to take care of. Things they needed to take care of, like calling off the funeral arrangements they had been making, canceling the appointments with realtors, putting their inheritance plans on hold. During my 2 weeks in the hospital, I watched my children carefully, looking for signs that I'd misunderstood what I'd heard in the ICU. Maybe they'd just been overwhelmed by the crisis and had said things they didn't mean. Maybe their planning had been a way of coping with the fear of losing me. But the more I observed them, the more I realized that what I'd overheard was exactly what they'd meant. They were disappointed that I was recovering. They were frustrated that their plans had been derailed. They were back to seeing me as a burden they'd have to deal with for an unknown number of additional years. The house is going to be too much for you now, Dad, Jessica said during one visit. You should really consider selling it and moving into a senior community. It would be so much easier for you, Michael added. No maintenance, no yard work, people around to check on you. And you could use the money to really enjoy your retirement, Brandon said. Travel, hobbies, whatever you want. They were still trying to get me to sell the house, just with a different justification now. Instead of liquidating my estate after my death, they wanted me to liquidate it while I was alive so they could start accessing their inheritance early. When I was discharged from the hospital, I was weak but determined to regain my independence. The kids offered to help me get settled at home, but their help felt perfunctory, like they were checking off items on a list rather than actually caring about my comfort. You should really think about getting a medical alert system, Jessica said as she helped me arrange my medications, in case something happens again. Maybe a housekeeper too, Michael suggested. Someone to help with cleaning and cooking. And definitely a landscaping service, Brandon added. You can't be doing yard work anymore. All their suggestions involve spending my money on services that would make their lives easier by reducing their sense of obligation to help me. They weren't trying to help me maintain my independence. They were trying to outsource the responsibility of caring for me while they waited for the next health crisis to finish what this one had started. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to use the time I had left, however much that might be, to find out exactly what my children were planning and to make sure they understood the consequences of treating their father like a financial asset rather than a human being. I wasn't going to die quietly and leave them to profit from a lifetime of selfishness. I was going to live loudly and make sure they learned what it meant to actually love and respect the man who'd sacrificed everything for them. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep their greed went and how long they'd been planning to cash in on my death. The first thing I did when I got home from the hospital was hire a private investigator. I needed to know exactly what my children had been doing while they thought I was dying, and I suspected there was more to their planning than just casual conversations about selling my house. Mr. Briggs, said Janet Walsh, the investigator I hired, what exactly are you looking for? I want to know if my children have been making concrete plans to liquidate my assets. I want to know if they've been consulting with lawyers, realtors, financial advisors, anyone who might help them access my money quickly after I die. That's a painful thing to investigate about your own family, she said. Are you sure you want to know the truth? I need to know. I've been living under the illusion that my children love me, and I need to understand how wrong I've been. The investigation took 3 weeks and the results were even worse than I'd expected. Janet's report showed that Jessica had indeed contacted a realtor about appraising my house, but not just while I was in the ICU. She'd first reached out 6 months earlier, asking about market conditions and how quickly houses in my neighborhood typically sold. Michael had consulted with a lawyer about estate planning and inheritance tax implications, specifically asking about the process for liquidating assets quickly after someone's death. He'd also gotten quotes from several companies that buy construction equipment and tools. Brandon had researched my house's value on multiple real estate websites and had even driven by with someone who turned out to be an appraiser, getting an informal assessment of the property's worth. But the most damaging discovery was that all three of them had been meeting regularly to discuss what they called Dad's situation. Janet had found evidence of group text messages going back over a year where they discussed my health, my finances, and their concerns about me potentially remarrying or making financial decisions that might reduce their inheritance. "We need to keep an eye on him," read one message from Jessica. "He's getting too friendly with that Linda woman. Maybe we should suggest he set up a trust or something," Michael had written. "Make sure his money is protected." "Protected from what?" Brandon had responded. "Protected from him spending it on himself?" "Protected from gold diggers and bad decisions," Jessica had replied. "He's not getting any younger, and old people make stupid financial choices. They'd been managing me, monitoring me, protecting their financial interests for over a year. This wasn't just a response to my heart attack. This was a long-term strategy to ensure that when I died, they'd be able to quickly convert my life's work into cash." Armed with this information, I decided to test them one more time. I called a family meeting and told them I'd been thinking about their suggestions regarding the house. "You know, kids, you might be right about the house being too much for me," I said as we sat around my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped them with homework for years. "I've been thinking about selling it and moving into a senior community." The change in their energy was immediate and obvious. They perked up, leaned forward, suddenly became very interested in the conversation. "That's great, Dad," Jessica said, unable to hide her excitement. "I think that's a really smart decision." "We can help you find a nice place," Michael offered. "Something with good amenities and healthcare services." "And we can help you get the best price for the house," Brandon added. "I know the market pretty well." "Actually," I said, "I was thinking about something else. Instead of selling the house, I might donate it to charity. There's an organization that builds homes for veterans, and they could probably use the money more than I needed." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that kitchen as my children processed what I just said. "Dad," Jessica said slowly, "that's very generous, but don't you think you should keep the money for your own care? What if you need expensive medical treatment? Or what if you want to travel, do things you've always wanted to do?" Michael added, his voice strained. "Besides," Brandon said, "don't you think you should discuss major financial decisions with your family? We might have some good advice." There it was. The real concern wasn't my welfare or my happiness. It was their inheritance being donated to charity instead of being passed down to them. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I think I'm capable of making my own financial decisions. After all, I managed to build a pretty good life for all of us over the years." "Of course you did, Dad," Jessica said quickly. "We just want to make sure you're thinking everything through." "I am thinking everything through," I said. "I'm thinking about what really matters, about what kind of legacy I want to leave, about what would make me feel good about the life I've lived." "But Dad," Michael said, "we're your legacy, your children. Don't you want to leave something for us?" "I thought I already had," I said. "I thought I left you with good education, strong values, and the knowledge that you were deeply loved. Isn't that enough?" The discomfort in the room was palpable. None of them knew how to respond to that question because the answer was clearly no. The education, values, and love weren't enough. They wanted the money too. That's when I decided to implement the plan I'd been developing since I learned the truth about their feelings toward me. "Actually, kids, there's something else I want to discuss with you. I'm thinking about updating my will." Their attention sharpened like hunting dogs catching a scent. "I want to make sure everything is fair and reflects my current wishes," I continued. "So I'd like each of you to write me a letter explaining why you think you deserve to inherit my assets and what you plan to do with that inheritance." "Dad, that's kind of a weird request," Brandon said. "Is it? I worked for 50 years to accumulate these assets. I think I have the right to know how my children plan to use them. Think of it as a final school assignment." "What kind of letter are you looking for?" Jessica asked. "Just honest. Tell me what my money and property mean to you, what you do with them, why you think you've earned them. Take your time, really think about it." I gave them 2 weeks to write their letters, and during that time, I continued to recover my strength and plan my next moves. I also started making some changes to my actual will, changes that would reflect what I'd learned about my children's true character. The letters, when they came, were everything I'd expected and worse. Jessica's letter focused primarily on her financial needs and her children's future education costs. She barely mentioned our relationship or any memories we'd shared. It was essentially a business proposal for why she deserved my money. Michael's letter was similar, outlining his mortgage, his kids' expenses, and his retirement planning needs. He thanked me for being a good provider, but said nothing about me being a good father or a person he'd miss. Brandon's letter was the most honest and therefore the most hurtful. He acknowledged that he hadn't been a very attentive son, but said he hoped to do better with the financial foundation I'd be leaving him. He actually used the phrase return on investment when describing what I could expect from him after inheriting my money. Reading those letters was like getting confirmation of everything I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. My children saw me as a bank account with legs, a source of funding for their goals and dreams, but not as a person they valued for anything beyond my ability to provide for them. That's when I made the final decision about how to handle the rest of my life and my legacy. I called each of them individually and told them I'd made some changes to my will based on their letters. I've decided to leave each of you exactly what you've shown me you deserve, I told Jessica. What does that mean, Dad? It means you'll find out when the will is read, but I think you'll be surprised by how well I was listening to what you've been telling me about our relationship. I had similar conversations with Michael and Brandon, giving them just enough information to make them worry about what I'd decided, but not enough to let them plan around it. The next step was to start living the life I wanted to live, with the people who actually cared about me as a person rather than as a source of inheritance. I reconnected with Linda Morrison, the woman my children had driven me away from with their warnings about gold diggers. I told her the truth about why I'd broken things off, and she was understanding and forgiving. I knew your children didn't like me, she said, but I never understood why. I have my own money, my own house, my own life. I wasn't interested in yours. They weren't worried about you taking my money, I said. They were worried about you preventing them from taking it. Linda and I started dating again, and this time I didn't let my children's opinions influence my decisions. We traveled together, went to concerts and plays, enjoyed each other's company without worrying about anyone else's approval. I also started volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, using my construction skills to help build homes for families who needed them. The work was satisfying in a way that my paying jobs had never been, because I could see the immediate impact of my efforts on people's lives. Mr. Briggs, said Maria Santos, a single mother whose home I'd helped build, you've given my children a future. They're going to grow up in a real home because of people like you. That meant something. It reminded me that my skills and my heart could still make a difference in the world, that my value wasn't just in the money I'd accumulated, but in what I could still contribute. I started spending time with people who enjoyed my company for its own sake. Fellow volunteers, other seniors at the community center, neighbors who invited me over for dinner, not because they wanted something from me, but because they liked having me around. And I continued to watch my children carefully, documenting their behavior, their requests for money, their obvious frustration with my continued independence and good health. 6 months after my heart attack, Jessica asked me for a loan to help with her daughter's college tuition. I know you've got plenty of money just sitting in the bank, Dad. It would really help us out. It was the first time she'd asked me for anything since my recovery, and I could tell it galled her to have to ask instead of just inheriting. How much do you need? I asked. $20,000 would cover the whole semester. And when would you pay it back? Well, eventually it'll all come back to me anyway, right? When I died. She couldn't even say the words, but she was already spending my money based on my eventual death. I'll think about it, I told her. Michael made a similar request a few weeks later, asking for help with a down payment on a new house. It's a great investment opportunity, Dad, And since I'll probably inherit the construction business stuff anyway, it makes sense for me to get established in a better neighborhood. Brendan didn't ask for money directly, but he started hinting that I should help him start his own graphic design business. You always said you wanted us to be successful, Dad. This could be my big break. All three of them were treating my money like it was already theirs, like they were just waiting for me to die so they could stop asking permission to spend it. That's when I knew it was time to show them exactly what their attitude had cost them. The year following my heart attack taught me more about love, family, and human nature than the previous 72 years combined. Not just about my children's character, but about my own role in creating the people they'd become. The first lesson was about the difference between providing and loving. For most of my children's lives, I'd confused giving them things with giving them love. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to buy them clothes, toys, cars, and education, thinking that my sacrifices were expressions of love that they'd recognize and appreciate. But what I'd actually taught them was that love came in the form of material things, that my value as a father was tied to my ability to provide, and that relationships were transactions where affection could be purchased with money and gifts. You trained them to see you as a source of funding, Dr. Williams, the therapist I'd started seeing, explained during one of our sessions. Every time they asked for something and you said yes, you reinforced the idea that their relationship with you was about what you could give them, not who you were as a person. The second lesson was about the importance of boundaries in relationships. I'd never said no to my children when they asked for money or help, even when doing so stretched my finances or exhausted my energy. I'd thought that being a good father meant always being available, always providing, always sacrificing my own needs for theirs. But what I'd actually done was teach them that I had no value beyond my utility to them, that my feelings and needs didn't matter, and that they could take from me without giving anything back. Healthy relationships require reciprocity, Dr. Williams explained. When one person always gives and the other always takes, you don't have a relationship, you have exploitation. The third lesson was about the difference between respect and entitlement. I'd wanted my children to feel secure and loved, so I'd made sure they never had to worry about money or struggle for things they wanted. I thought I was giving them a gift, but what I'd actually given them was a sense of entitlement to my resources and a lack of appreciation for the work required to earn them. They'd never learned to value what I provided because they'd never had to do without it. The fourth lesson was about the power of honesty in relationships. For years, I pretended not to notice my children's selfishness because I didn't want to confront them or risk damaging our relationships. I'd made excuses for their behavior, rationalized their neglect, and convinced myself that they loved me even when their actions suggested otherwise. But dishonesty in relationships, even well-intentioned dishonesty, creates more problems than it solves. By not holding my children accountable for their selfishness, I'd enabled it to grow until it became the defining characteristic of our relationships. The fifth lesson was about the importance of self-worth. I'd based my identity as a father on my children's approval and appreciation. When they were happy with what I provided, I felt like a good father. When they seemed disappointed or distant, I felt like a failure. But tying your self-worth to other people's approval, even your children's approval, is a recipe for manipulation and disappointment. My value as a person wasn't determined by how much my children appreciated me. It was determined by my own character, integrity, and contributions to the world. The sixth lesson was about the difference between being alone and being lonely. After Patricia died, I'd felt desperately lonely and had looked to my children to fill that emotional void. When they weren't available or interested, I'd felt rejected and worthless. But I learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. Loneliness comes from feeling disconnected from people who care about you. I'd been lonely even when my children were around because they didn't really care about me as a person. Now that I was building relationships with people who genuinely enjoyed my company, I felt less lonely even when I was physically alone. The seventh lesson was about the nature of legacy. I'd always assumed that my legacy would be my children, that they would carry forward the values I taught them and remember me as a loving father who'd sacrifice for their welfare. But I learned that legacy isn't about what you leave behind for people who share your DNA. Legacy is about the positive impact you have on the world, the people you help, the problems you solve, the love you give to anyone who's willing to receive it. The eighth lesson was about the power of choice in relationships. For years, I'd felt obligated to maintain relationships with my children, regardless of how they treated me, because they were family, and family was supposed to stick together. But I learned that all healthy relationships, even family relationships, are sustained by ongoing choice. People choose to stay connected, choose to treat each other with respect, choose to prioritize the relationship even when it's difficult. My children had stopped making those choices years ago, but I'd kept making them out of obligation rather than genuine connection. The ninth lesson was about forgiveness versus enabling. I thought that forgiving my children's selfishness and neglect was the loving thing to do, that holding grudges would make me a bitter person and a bad father. But there's a difference between forgiveness and enabling. Forgiveness means letting go of anger and resentment for your own peace of mind. Enabling means continuing to reward bad behavior and pretending that harmful actions don't have consequences. The 10th lesson was about the importance of authentic relationships. The most healing part of my recovery wasn't just accepting the truth about my children's feelings toward me. It was discovering what genuine mutual care felt like in my relationships with Linda, my fellow volunteers, and the new friends I'd made. You know what I like about spending time with you, Rob? Linda said to me one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. You don't want anything from me except my company, and I don't want anything from you except yours. It's the most relaxing relationship I've ever had. These lessons prepared me for the most important decision I'd made since my heart attack: how to handle my will and my children's expectations about their inheritance. I'd spent months thinking about what would be fair, what would be loving, and what would give my children the best chance to learn from their mistakes and become better people. The answer wasn't to punish them by leaving them nothing. That would just make them bitter and confirm their belief that I was selfish. The answer was to give them exactly what they'd shown me they valued about our relationship. The reading of my will took place on a Tuesday morning in October 2024, exactly 1 year after my heart attack. I was very much alive to attend, which seemed to surprise my children more than anything else in the document. My lawyer, David Chen, had initially questioned my decisions, but after I explained what I'd learned about my children's true feelings toward me, he'd agreed to draft the will according to my wishes. To my daughter, Jessica, David read, who wrote that she valued me primarily as a provider and hoped to use her inheritance for her children's education, I leave $50,000 to be placed in a trust fund specifically for her children's college expenses. The money cannot be accessed for any other purpose. Jessica's face went through several expressions as she processed this. She was getting money, but not the amount she'd expected, and not in the way she'd expected. To my son Michael, who wrote that he appreciated me being a good provider and hoped to use his inheritance for his retirement planning, I leave $50,000 to be placed in a retirement account that cannot be accessed until he reaches age 65. Michael looked confused and angry. He'd been expecting to inherit hundreds of thousands of dollars that he could use immediately for whatever he wanted. To my son, Brandon, who wrote that he hoped to do better with the financial foundation I'd be leaving him, I leave $50,000 to be placed in a business development account that can only be used for legitimate business expenses related to starting his graphic design company. Brandon was clearly doing math in his head, trying to figure out where the rest of my money was going. The remainder of my estate, David continued, including my house, my construction business assets, and all other financial accounts, I leave to the Veterans Housing Initiative, with the stipulation that any homes built with these funds be dedicated to the memory of Patricia Briggs, my beloved wife, who understood the difference between loving someone and using them. The silence in that room was deafening. My children sat there staring at David like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Dad, Jessica finally said, is this some kind of joke? No joke, I said. This is what happens when you spend years treating your father like a bank account with legs instead of a person who loved you. But we do love you, Michael protested. No, you don't. You love my money. You've made that very clear in everything you've said and done since your mother died. Dad, you can't be serious about this, Brandon said. We're your children. We're your family. You stopped being my family the day you started planning my funeral while I was lying in the ICU, I said. Did you think I couldn't hear you talking about selling my house and dividing up my tools? Did you think I didn't notice that you were relieved about my impending death? The color drained from their faces as they realized what I'd heard. We were scared and upset, Jessica said. People say things they don't mean when they're emotional. You weren't emotional, I said. You were calculating. You were planning. You've been planning for over a year based on what the private investigator found. You hired a private investigator? Michael asked, incredulous. I needed to know the truth about what my children really thought of me, and now I do. Dad, please, Brandon said. You're making a mistake. We can work this out. I'm not making a mistake. I'm making a choice. I'm choosing to leave my money to people who will use it to help families instead of people who see families as sources of income. But what about blood? Jessica asked. What about family loyalty? What about it? Where was your family loyalty when you were counting down the days until I die? Where was your love when you were complaining about having to pretend to enjoy spending time with me? They had no answer for that because there was no answer. They'd been caught being exactly who they really were, and now they were facing the consequences of their choices. You each get $50,000, which is more than most children get from their parents, I said. But you get it in ways that force you to use it responsibly, the way I always hoped you'd learn to live. And what about you? Michael asked. What happens to you? I'm going to live the rest of my life surrounded by people who actually care about me. I'm going to marry Linda, travel to places I've always wanted to see, and volunteer with organizations that appreciate the work I can still do. I'm going to be happy for whatever time I have left. You can't just cut us out of your life, Jessica said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I'm not cutting you out. You cut yourselves out years ago. I'm just finally acknowledging what's been true for a long time. Dad, please, Brandon said, give us another chance. We can be better. You've had 20 years of chances since you became adults. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you. That was 18 months ago. Since then, I've married Linda, and we've traveled to Ireland, Scotland, and Norway. We've taken a cruise through the Caribbean and spent a month visiting national parks across the western United States. I built 3 houses with Habitat for Humanity and mentored 2 young men who were learning the construction trade. I've read to children at the local library and taught basic home repair skills at the community center. My children have tried to reconcile with me several times, usually around holidays or when they're facing financial difficulties, but their attempts at reconnection always involve requests for money or complaints about how unfairly I'm treating them. Dad, I'm your daughter, Jessica said during our last conversation. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Being my daughter means you carry my DNA, I told her. It doesn't mean you're entitled to my money or my forgiveness. Those things have to be earned through your actions, not inherited through your birth. None of them has made any effort to understand why I made the decisions I made or to acknowledge how their behavior affected me. They're still focused on what they think they deserve rather than what they've actually earned. Last month, I received a letter from the Veterans Housing Initiative telling me that the first house built with my donation had been completed. A young veteran named Thomas Rodriguez and his family were moving into a 3-bedroom home that would never have existed without the money my children thought should have been theirs. Mr. Briggs, the letter said. Thomas wanted you to know that he's naming his newborn son Rob in honor of the man whose generosity made his family's home possible. That baby will grow up in a house built with love instead of greed, by people who understood that family is about more than financial transactions. That's the legacy I wanted to leave, and that's the legacy that will matter long after I'm gone. If this story hit home, share your own experience in the comments. Drop a line about a time when you had to choose between your dignity and someone else's greed. Don't forget to subscribe and tell a brother who needs to hear that his worth isn't determined by what he can provide for ungrateful people. This is his stories where men rise above together. And remember, fellas, your children are not entitled to your money just because they share your DNA. Love is not a debt that can be repaid with inheritance. And family is about choice and commitment, not just biology and obligation. At 75, I wake up every morning grateful for the truth, even when it hurt. Grateful for Linda, who loves me for who I am, not what I can give her. Grateful for the work I can still do and the lives I can still touch. Grateful for the wisdom to finally understand the difference between being used and being loved. The family you choose is often stronger than the family you're born into. The love you give to people who appreciate it is more meaningful than the love you waste on people who take it for granted. The peace you create for yourself is more valuable than the approval you seek from others. My children may never understand what they lost when they chose greed over love, but I understand what I gained when I chose dignity over desperation, truth over denial, and authentic relationships over obligatory ones. The rest of my story is still being written, one grateful day at a time. If Rob's story just hit you in the gut like it hit me, I need you to do something right now. First, smash that subscribe button for his stories and ring that notification bell. This is where fathers come to hear the truth about sacrifice, love, and what happens when the people you raise see you as nothing more than a payday. We've got stories from brothers who've walked through the fire of ungrateful children and came out stronger on the other side. Second, hit that like button if you've ever wondered whether your kids appreciate the sacrifices you've made for them. Your likes tell YouTube that these stories matter, that fathers' experiences deserve to be heard, and that there's a brotherhood out here that understands what it means to give everything and get nothing back. Third, share this video with every father you know who needs to hear this message. Maybe it's your brother who's been bankrolling his adult kid's lifestyle. Maybe it's your buddy whose children only call when they need money. Maybe it's a man who needs to understand that love isn't measured by how much you can provide, but by how much respect you receive in return. Drop a comment below and let us know. Have you ever overheard your family talking about you like you were already gone? Have you ever realized that your children see you as an ATM instead of a person? Share your story. This brotherhood is built on truth, and your truth might be exactly what another father needs to hear. And if you're watching this thinking about your own father, about the sacrifices he made that you never appreciated, maybe it's time to pick up that phone. Don't wait until it's too late to say thank you. This is His Stories, where men rise above together. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, your worth isn't determined by what you can give people. It's determined by who you are when nobody's taking.